So like arguing with this secularist or secular humanist, I don't know what he is. Fill out the comment on this video about I don't know, is this Christian nationalism debate? I mean, I believe in American covenantalism. I don't know if that classifies as Christian nationalism. I mean, but it's pretty diverse though, the Christian nationalism stuff. So I don't really 100% agree with, like, I don't think nobody really agrees with each other, to be honest. Like, some believe in like mere Christendom or something, the other ones believe in like just Christian nationalism or something. I believe in American covenantalism. Like, should probably make a video, right, distinguishing the three. But anyway, I was arguing with this one guy. I said secular humanism isn't the American religion. American religion is biblical religion in its soul and mind, right? In the American soul and mind. And this guy brought up the Treaty of Tripoli. It's like, I tell you, that doesn't help you anymore. I told him that, he said Treaty of Tripoli has entered the chat, right? And then I said, you know, I've adopted that into the dissenting conscience of Christian America, as well as the metaphor of the wall. It's no longer an obstacle, like, yeah, that I've done videos on it, right? Yes, it's not an obstacle for me. And then, I think he misunderstood me, because he quoted me, dissenting conscience is a strange way to describe being unanimously ratified in the Senate. It says, no longer an obstacle. It's such a tell, dude. It's history, not a chess piece. You might as well admit to using motivated reasoning to reach your conclusion. That is why debating y'all is pointless. You have your own bespoke set of facts. Reality be damned. Do you believe that history is an objective endeavor, or are you a postmodernist about it? So that is exactly what kind of Christian nation America is, right? A dissenting Christian nation. That's what I mean. It's not strange at all. The federal government has a covenantal structure rather than an ecclesiastical one, so it doesn't determine the Christian nation, the people and their God and religious culture. Christian culture determines it, right? Yet because the federal government does not have an establishment of Christian religion, which in the context of like the metaphor of the wall, right, is pertaining to church and state. And so that way no imperial church of the past or a potential future, dissenting church, right? Like in the future could become a church of America, right? And so that's why it's necessary to just say like all of them be separated from the state on the federal level. In fact, the federal is like covenantal, right? That's what it means in Latin. So it has a covenant structure. He says that you've invented this entirely. It has no basis in reality. Point to anything that lays this out in the founding documents. And I said, no, I didn't, right? I didn't invent this. Like, it's not make-believe. I said that Madison and the founders cared about federalism, not actually secularism. Yeah, because it's not about secularism. The idea of secular ideology with, morality without God or whatever. It says, unless you meant no established national church, the Treaty of Tripoli and the Wall of Separation, like, it only makes sense if it's about protection from imperial ecclesiastical authoritarianism. And so I don't accept the secularist ideology, since all of that is interpretive, right? Because I'm interpreting it between, like, to me, like, it's a battle between American covenantalism and American secularism. Like, which one is the better interpretive frame, right? And so he just kind of laughs at me and he says, where have I referenced secularism? And then you dodged. And I told him that American covenantalism and American secularism are interpretive frameworks. Secularism fails to account for the religion they all spoke about. Like, they all spoke of as being part of the system, which is vital. Don't need a national church, since they all had a covenantal understanding based upon their religion. And they just keep asking me for founding documents. Where's this laid out? And they didn't all have a covenantal understanding, as several constitution signers had big misgivings about the church and even Christianity. Speaking of a single covenant of believers also flies in the face of the founders' understanding of the dangers of religious sectarianism. In the words of Madison, father of the First Amendment, the purpose of the separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood and for centuries, right? Which presupposes the ecclesiastical imperial religions of the Christian nations in Europe, right? And so, yes, they did. It's in their background, right? As far as their Christian education, Reformed theology is covenant theology, even federal theology. Even Jefferson and all of them come from a biblical religious background. Just like all the dissenting reformers in the colonies, they dictate the religious conscience and soul of America. In England, they understood the Revolutionary War as Presbyterian rebellion, all of which was grounded within a biblical framing, even in the colonial pulpits and sermons. They saw the Revolutionary War, within a biblical consciousness, right, which formulates the biblical soul of America, which you see from a continuous heritage or so, from the colonial days to even before that, right? Now, America's biblical paradigm is God and covenant, and so it inherits that from the Bible, and so it understands God and covenant pertaining to biblical thoughts and not Enlightenment thought in such a strict sense where you make God impersonal, right? Because I think some people, it was like Spinoza or someone, so I watched the whole video on Spinoza, and he thinks that it's a brilliant idea, the covenant idea, but he reduces God to nature and not personal, and he thinks it's like a human invention, which to me just is going to undermine the whole brilliance of the idea. And so it's like, well, in the American history, you have to believe that God is personal, that God is active. This is what you see in the American history itself. So it's within our nature to understand God and covenant in biblical terms and not secularist terms, right? When it comes to the American religion and in the context of American history. And I said that American covenantalism is an overarching religious political frame, independent of Christian sectarianism. Religious establishments, aka churches, also known as churches, aren't needed for true Christian religion. That is why I said the dissenting conscience and Lockean Christianity is how we can understand how America is Christian. And then I said that Madison and Jefferson's federalism reflects a covenantal structure. Authority is distributed, power limited, and all governance presupposes moral accountability, while neither man was like orthodox in theology, and both operated within a Judeo-Christian moral imagination, basically a biblical imagination that understood liberty as stewardship, a gift under God, not from government. The early American covenant then was not secular but plural, grounded in the belief that free individuals under God could govern themselves through consent and moral restraint. This was a practical form of covenantal stewardship. Each level of authority, personal, local, and national, bound by duty and mutual accountability under divine providence, right? And this guy keeps trying to undermine my position, right? And he says and yet no mention in any of the founding documents, no justification in American legal tradition. The exact opposite implied in their letters and writings, especially the Federalist Papers. Just because something resembles something doesn't mean is that thing. So he's talking about feelings or whatever, and that's all you have, feelings. You don't engage anything I say, and you just bulldoze right along with your beliefs, and that's precisely the level of consideration non-evangelicals will receive in your secured old world or scarred old world or whatever it means. And I tell him, what feelings are you talking about? Everything you stated can be applied to secular ideology. And that is only one interpretation of America, which I think is a total distortion. And then I give him a source, right, that I got from the chat, right? He said that America's political order grew out of Reformed covenantal thought. America's political order grew out of Reformed covenantal thought, not secular detachment. Federalism itself from the Latin fodeus means covenant, and it is a direct theological inheritance from Protestant political theology. One, colonial foundations were explicitly covenantal. The Mayflower Compact, 1620, in the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. This was not secular contract theory, it was an act of collective covenanting under divine witness. The compact created a civil society under God, rooted in mutual duty, consent, and moral accountability. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, 1639, for the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, or Jesus, which we now profess, we enter into combination and confederation together. The first written constitution in the Western world combined religious covenant and with civil governance. This became a model for later American constitutionalism. There's essence of other charters and compacts that are like that. He's talking about all superseded by the Constitution. The evidence you muster demonstrates that just how out of date your thinking is. America is more than just the first wave of Puritan migration. And I said, what exactly is outdated? A godless constitutional understanding has always been a distortion, right? Because I assume he's going to try to argue for the godless constitution. And I told him that no one in the Constitutional Convention believed what secularists presuppose, right? We just to be without God or so in a religious context. And I said that the founders believed in being aided by God, right? Being helped by God, even in the Constitutional Convention, which undermines completely the idea of a godless constitution. And then I think that's where it stopped. That's from a few days ago. But like this, I mean, it's not an essay, it's just a question I asked chat, right? Based on presuppositions that I've been arguing from. And so I was just going over the claims that this person made, right? At least, I think one or two, I think, if I can remember correctly. I think it was like, because it wasn't really like long exchange or so, like maybe like 12 replies or so. But anyway, he made like this one claim or whatever you want to call it. He says like appealing to the pilgrims is outdated, right? And put it in here in this what it says. This is why this argument collapses instantly. It says your critic is making a category error, confusing historical origin with contemporary application. So the breakdown is: 1. Foundational origins are never outdated. No one says appealing to the Magna Carta is outdated. Appealing to the Hebrew Bible for Western law is outdated. Appealing to Roman republicanism is outdated. Appealing to natural law from Aquinas is outdated. Historical foundations don't expire. They explain why something exists in the first place. The Pilgrims, and more broadly 17th century covenantal Protestantism, supplied the vocabulary of covenant, the idea of consent, the belief in the equality of souls, the right to resist tyranny, the union of moral law plus civil law, congregational self-government, federal compacts, Mayflower Compact and federalism, all the way to federalism. If you remove those, the entire conceptual structure of the American Republic collapses. That's not outdated, that's structural. Yeah, because I always thought it was weird the way they say it that way. It's because they have a weird interpretive frame, right? Or how they interpret things. But it also doesn't help when Christians, when they try to deal with these, I think some of them are just as incoherent, right? Every time I hear them argue about how it's not a Christian nation or how it is or so, right? Anyway. The second one is the covenantal republic is not a reenactment of the Pilgrims, it's a development of their principles. The argument that pilgrim origins are outdated is like saying the Constitution is outdated because it's based on English common law. Human rights are outdated because they come from classical natural law. Science is outdated because it began with medieval universities. The question is not whether the Pilgrims wore funny hats. The question is whether their core political theological ideas remain relevant. And they do, because the Declaration is a covenantal oath. The Constitution is a federal covenant. Literally, Fideus equals covenant. American federalism is structured identically to Protestant federal theology. Covenant is mutual consent, limited powers, delegated authority, right of resistance, covenant breaking, magistrates lose authority. Now, this structure is not it's not antique. It's what holds the republic together. Yeah, that's kind of reminds me, right? There's when the ones who say that America is a nation of ideas or whatever, I'm like, okay, but there are certain ideas that are foundational to the republic, and that would either cause it to cease to exist or to continue, right? But to continue in a blessed state rather than in a state of permanent revolution or whatever, right? But you want to remain in a blessed state of like peace and, you know, pursuit of happiness, liberty, right, and all this stuff, right? And so, anyway, it's also why I don't like the secularist understanding. I'm not saying I favor theocracy, which I don't, but I think both kind of undermine the principles, right? And that they can make or break the republic if you're not careful, right? But I definitely don't think the secularist interprets it faithfully. I think he causes it to be undermined at a foundational level, right? Our founding. Secularists depend on covenantal concepts while denying the source. And it gives a polemical strike. Every modern secular argument for rights, liberty, equality, or government by consent is parasitic on covenant theology. A secularist cannot defend inherent rights, moral equality, dignity, liberty of conscience, the rule of law, limits on government, the people as the source of authority, without borrowing from the worldview of the Pilgrims and dissenting Protestants. They want the fruit while denying the root. That's not modern. That's incoherent. For the Pilgrims matter because the founders themselves appealed to covenant tradition. Adams explicitly traced American political culture to the Calvinist republics. Jefferson assumed covenantal and dissenting Christian assumptions, liberty of conscience, self-evident rights, God-given equality. Witherspoon imported Scottish common-sense realism plus federal theology into the founding era. Calvinist federalism shaped the language of compact consent, mutual obligation. The Declaration sounds exactly like a covenant lawsuit, Hebrew Deuteronomic pattern. This isn't outdated. This is the genealogy of the American mind. So without Pilgrim covenantal thought, the U.S. becomes a secular technocracy, not a republic. Remove covenant theology and what's left. Rights become social constructs, equality becomes fiction, liberty becomes privilege, government legitimacy becomes procedural, morality becomes subjective, the state becomes the grantor of freedoms. So, and you no longer have a republic, you have a managerial system without transcendent limits. Covenant theology is the only thing that prevents political nihilism. The Pilgrims aren't outdated. Secular nihilism is. Secularism is a late ideological experiment, 19th century onward, with no historical depth and no moral foundation. The Pilgrims gave us consent-based liberty, self-governed communities, the idea of popular sovereignty, covenantal accountability under God, limits on magistrates, liberty of conscience, federal compacting, Republican resistance theory. Secularism gave us procedural majoritarianism, moral relativism, bureaucratic systems, technocratic control, identity fragmentation. Which one is outdated? The one that lasted 400 years or the one that is collapsing in real time? It says 7, the correct framing. The Pilgrims provide the grammar of American liberty. Covenant is the shared grammar. Declaration is the moral covenant. Constitution is civil covenant. Federalism is covenantal structure. Rights equals covenantal obligations grounded in the Creator. Equality is covenantal anthropology. You don't throw away grammar because it's old. You use it because without it, speech collapses into chaos. The closing, and it gives me like a closing rhetorical line for my essay. I do want to address the other things in more detail or so, like the Treaty of Tripoli. But I asked it something else. I said the other thing that he says when I was interacting with him. He says that all this is superseded by the Constitution, which isn't Christian, basically. That's what he was implying. Because he said, it started off with the Treaty of Tripoli, and then eventually got down to just him accusing me of making stuff up. And I'm like, I didn't make anything up. It's based on the books that I've read, and based on the essays that I've generated, right, on how to understand it as a Christian nation or so. Hold on. Yeah, so anyway, so the claim that the Constitution supersedes the Pilgrims and therefore supersedes covenantal Christianity, the Constitution isn't Christian, why this claim collapses instantly. The Constitution does not supersede the Pilgrim covenantal tradition, it assumes it. A secularist imagines Pilgrim covenant replaced, then Constitution, new system. But historically and intellectually, the flow is from the Pilgrim covenant to two colonial compacts, two state constitutions, and two articles into the U.S. Constitution. That's basically how it flows, right? And it's like a lineage, I guess. And so the Constitution did not replace covenantal culture. It institutionalized it into a federal legal framework. The proof, the states kept Christian oaths, Christian test clauses, and Christian Sabbatarian laws after 1787. Every state constitution at the founding referenced God, providence, morality, or Christian duties. The Constitution was built on the assumption that the states retained their religious character and moral order. The Constitution is not a replacement, it is an aggregation of covenantal polities. The Constitution is silent on religion because it presupposes a Christian moral culture. A secularist misreads silence as secularism, but the founders explained the silence explicitly. 1. Religion is a state matter. The federal government has no jurisdiction over religion. It does not forbid God. It forbids federal meddling. And 2, the founders believed religion, specifically Christian morality, was indispensable. Washington, Adams, Jay, Wilson, Rush, and even Jefferson all agreed a republic cannot function without virtue, and virtue cannot exist without religious principles. Washington, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Adams, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. In other words, the Constitution presupposes Christian morality the way geometry presupposes axioms. And so the Constitution itself, a covenantal document. The word federal comes from fideus, covenant, right? Covenant structure. The preamble equals oath and mission. Articles equals stipulations. Delegated powers equals covenant limits. Supremacy clause equals covenant hierarchy. Amendments equals covenantal reform. Ratification equals consent of the governed. This is covenantal theology translated into political legal form. The Constitution is essentially a secularized Hebrew Puritan covenant, not an anti-Christian document. Supersession misunderstands American constitutionalism. The Constitution did not abolish the Declaration, negate natural law, erase the Creator, reject Christian morality, dissolve state-level religious culture. The Constitution derives its legitimacy from the Declaration. Jefferson, the Declaration is the expression of the American mind. The Constitution is not the foundation, the Declaration is. The Constitution is the structure built upon the Declaration's moral foundation. You cannot say the roof supersedes the foundation. Even irreligious founders said the Constitution requires Christian morality. Jefferson called himself a real Christian, meaning a follower of Jesus' moral teachings. Believed the Gospels contained the purest moral code, grounded rights in nature and nature's God, affirmed that Jesus gave the world the highest ethic of benevolence and justice, argued for liberty of conscience because of Christian dissenting tradition. Madison trained at Princeton under Witherspoon, a Calvinist who taught federal theology plus Scottish realism, believed government needed citizens formed in virtue, defended conscience using Christian anthropology. Even the least sectarian founders weren't secularists in the modern sense. The Constitution cannot be not Christian because it is not a creed. It is a procedural charter, not a religious document. Saying the Constitution isn't Christian is like saying the rules of baseball aren't Christian, the DMV handbook isn't Christian, a marriage license isn't Christian. Correct, because they aren't supposed to be. What matters is the people, not the paper. The Constitution was designed for a Christian majority, Christian ethical culture that already existed. It regulates civil power, not doctrine, precisely to protect Christian conscience. This is a Christian political move, not a secular one. If anything, the seventh point, if anything, the Constitution entrenches critical political philosophy rather than superseding it. A covenantal republic requires limited magistrates, rule of law, equality of souls, government by consent, liberty of conscience, moral accountability, natural rights grounded in God. Where do those ideas come from? Not from secularism, not from Enlightenment materialism, not from French radicalism. They come from Hebraic covenant tradition, Reformed covenant theology, Scottish common sense realism, Lockean Christian anthropology, Puritan federal theology, dissenting Protestant liberty of conscience. The Constitution formalizes these. It does not supersede Christian covenantal thought, it codifies it. 8. The Treaty of Paris and other documents refute the secularist reading. Treaty of Paris, 1783, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity, signed by some founders. The Constitution had superseded Christianity. This treaty would be impossible. The Treaty of Tripoli's famous, the first one was Treaty of Paris, 1783. Yeah, there were other treatises that the founders signed that had Christianity in it as well. And so this is some of the stuff that secularists don't understand, right? Or they don't bring up or so. And continuing, the Treaty of Tripoli's famous phrase simply means the U.S. federal government is not a Christian denomination or confessional state, not that the people, culture, morality, or founding philosophy were non-Christian. It just gives me a polemical finisher. It says that the Constitution no more supersedes the Christian covenantal foundations of America than a ship's frame supersedes the ocean on which it floats. The Constitution presupposes the moral waters of the Declaration, and the Declaration rests on the covenantal understanding of a people who believe their rights come from God. And then I asked it, so basically federalism is about faithful covenantal stewardship and not secular ideology, right? Because remember, I'm interpreting it as an American covenant nation, right? I'm presupposing the covenant ethos, where the secularist presupposes the secular ethos, right? So it's through one variable you can make sense or distort everything, right? And so that's why I grounded upon American covenantalism, is what I believe it should be called. Federalism equals covenant stewardship in political form. So here's the core argument. Federalism is not secular, a secular ideology. Federalism is a covenantal structure, a political translation of biblical and Reformed covenant theology. It is about distributed authority, mutual obligation, consent of the governed, limits on magistrates, moral accountability, duty and responsibility, oaths as binding, sacred commitments. These are covenantal principles, not secular ones. Secularism rejects higher accountability. Federalism assumes it. Federalism as covenantal stewardship. The word federal comes from fideus, Latin for covenant, or treaty, or sacred bond. The framers adopted this terminology intentionally because a covenant distributes authority, a covenant binds parties by mutual duties, a covenant presupposes God as witness, a covenant requires virtue and self-governance. A covenant protects conscience, a covenant limits human power. This is the structure of Deuteronomy. This is the structure of Puritan political covenants. This is the structure of the Mayflower Compact. This is the structure of the Declaration and Constitution. But the Constitution is not secular. It is structurally covenantal. Secularism is actually the opposite of federalism. Secularism centralizes power by removing ultimate accountability. Without transcendence, the state becomes the final authority. This produces consolidation, bureaucratic supremacy, positive rights ideology, relativistic lawmaking, moral subjectivism, culture atomization. In contrast, federalism limits the state because it assumes the state is not God. This is covenantal logic, or that is covenantal logic. Federalism says no single sovereign, multiple covenant authorities, moral communities with integrity, conscience above state, God above all human power. This is anti-secular to its core. The founders saw federalism as religious in nature. Even Jefferson and Madison, the least orthodox, saw federalism as a moral religious principle rooted in the Creator and conscience. Madison and Memorial and Remonstrance. Religion must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage as he believes to be accepted to him. Right, render unto God what is God's, right? Similar to what Jesus said, I guess, right? So that's not secularism, that's covenantal liberty of conscience. Jefferson notes on Virginia, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? This is not secular thinking, this is covenantal anthropology. Then Declaration plus Constitution equals covenantal order. The founding architecture, Declaration is like the moral covenant, as it equals appealing to the supreme judge of the world with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Constitution is the legal covenant. Fideus, structured powers, mutual obligations, consent, governance. Together they form a two-part covenant document just like Exodus, deliverance and identity. Deuteronomy, law plus structure, Puritan covenant, mission plus polity. This is covenantal political theology translated into English Republican or Enlightenment Republican language. It's not secular, not atheistic, not neutral. Just gives me a polemical, something I could put in my essay or so. It's like, it says federalism is not a secular ideology, but the political expression of covenantal stewardship, a system designed for a people who believe their rights came from God, their duties from conscience, and their rulers from consent. And then and I asked him, did he also mention the Treaty of Tripoli, right? Even though we sort of addressed a little bit of it. But yeah, because I know he mentioned it at first, like as if it defeats my position or so, which it doesn't. And I said that this is how to obliterate it based on the presuppositions of what I'm arguing, right? And the secularists claim the Treaty of Tripoli proves America wasn't founded as a Christian nation because it says the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, right? Because the Christian nation that we're talking about, right? How America is Christian is founded upon the Christian people, which are dissenting Christian nation, right? Dissenting Christians with their diverse Christian cultures, and yet they have one God, right? And so that is how it is dictated and how dissenting consciousness, right? This establishment is important to the identity of dissenting Christian people, right? This is why it's part of the American Christian identity, basically. Just like the federal constitutional republic is all part of the American Christian identity, as well as the dissenting consciousness, right? This is why we don't interpret ourselves as a Christian nation pertaining to how historically it was defined, right? Because the guy I was arguing with, he also presupposed the same thing, which is why, and that is the problem, because he presupposes historically how it is defined, but America is not traditionally a Christian nation because of radical dissent. Many Christians who are like Jefferson, right? He shared a lot of that in common with those kinds of Christians. And so, but they still saw themselves as Christian people. And the gospel, the covenantalism, all of that, biblical values basically, biblical values are still important, even to radical dissenting Christians. Okay? And so, sorry. The truth, that line does not mean the people weren't Christian, the states weren't Christian, the culture wasn't Christian, the moral order wasn't Christian, the founding principles weren't Christian. It means something extremely specific. The federal government is not a Christian denomination or confessional state. That's all. And that is the exact same meaning as no national church, no religious test for federal office. Religion left to the states. Federal government has no jurisdiction over religion. So it is federalism statement. It is a federalism statement, not a secularism statement. The Treaty of Tripoli line refers to the federal government, not the nation, the people, the states, or the founding culture. So I read the actual line carefully. The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Notice it's not the people, not the states, not the nation, not American civilization, not American moral foundations, not our rights or principles. Yes, it only says the federal government is not a Christian religious establishment. Right, when you presuppose the metaphor of the wall, because it's in the name of separation of church and state, right? The principle of separation can still be accounted for by the dissenting consciousness of a Christian people, right? And so it says, which is 100% consistent with the First Amendment, Jefferson's Danbury letter, Madison's federalism, state authority over religion. This line helps your argument. The federal government has limits because America is a covenantal federation, not a consolidated national church state. The line was written to reassure a Muslim nation that the U.S. does not impose Christian identity by federal law. Barbary states believe Christian nations equals nations largely ruled by bishops, popes, or kings. In the name of Christ, the U.S. was saying that we aren't like Spain or France. We don't have a federal church that has protected American sailors from being assumed to be religious enemies of Islam. It was a diplomatic language, not theological philosophy. The same founders signed explicitly Christian treatises elsewhere. This is the strongest counter below, like the Treaty of Paris, 1783, ends the revolution, right? Opening words were in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. The same generation, same leaders. Not secularists. No secularists can explain this. Treaty with the Delaware Indians, 1778. Congress recommends Christian education for a native youth. Articles of Confederation. The NWIF in the year of our Lord. Northwest Ordinance, 1787. Passed by the same Congress that passed the Constitution. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to a good government. Secularists always conveniently ignore these. Right, that's why I say it's all about presupposing the right presupposition, which encapsulates all of the founding, all of the whole thing, right? The whole picture, like having the right frame that belongs to the picture, basically, right? And so this line in Treaty in Tripoli was removed in the next treaty because it was seen as unnecessary and misleading. The 1805 revision, Treaty of Tripoli 2.0, removes the not founded on the Christian religion line. If that phrase were the true interpretation of the founding, why did the founders themselves discard it? The answer is because it was diplomatic, not philosophical. 5. Even the Muslim ambassador understood the U.S. as culturally Christian. When Ambassador Abdurrahman famously said to Thomas Jefferson, says, we have a completely different religion. And so neither side pretended America was secular. Yeah, because secularism is not religion, right? And then that's why they cannot account for the indispensable religious pillar of the republic, which is part of the American system. So Christianity being actual religion defines American religion. This is why I call it biblical religion in the context of Americanism or so, or the American understanding, right? Presuppositions or so. And so, so the Treaty of Tripoli line was about legal establishment, not civilization. And 6, the Declaration is the higher interpreting document, not random treaty phrasing. The hierarchy of American texts: Declaration of Independence, Creator, Judge, Providence, Natural Rights, Constitution, Framework plus Structure. 3 federal treatises: Diplomacy, not political philosophy. You don't interpret the foundational charter through the footnotes. You interpret the treatises, the treaties, through the founding principles. No treaty can overturn the Declaration. That gives me a kill shot. The line actually supports your argument. I say you're arguing that America is covenantal, that the people were religious, that the states were religious, that the culture was Christian, that the federal government is limited because of federalism, right, and presupposing the deity of the people, which is one God, the God of Christ, the same God of the Bible, right? And so it must be presupposing that God, even Lockean's liberalism, or his Christianity, basically, because it presupposes the same deity. And Jesus is moral covenantal philosophy, because Jesus is not a deist. He can only be understood as a religious Jewish, person, or a man of the covenant, right? Because even the New Testament is based on the covenantal thought of Jesus, right? And so you cannot understand the moral philosophy of Jesus, right, the ethical principles of Jesus, without presupposing his covenantal understanding, right? So Jesus is foundational to both Locke and Jefferson. And so that's why I believe when he writes the Declaration, he writes as a Christian, because he represents the Christian people. And the American mind reflects the American religion, which is biblical religion. That's why you see from the colonies, the Pilgrims, right, the dissenting reformers, the Revolutionary War, which was called the Presbyterian Rebellion in England, right? The Declaration, presupposing biblical, it's like written in the spirit of Christian covenantalism, biblical covenantalism, basically, which died back to the Pilgrims. And then you have the Constitutional Convention, which many founders believed that God aided not only in the Revolutionary War, but in the Constitutional Convention, which is why we should presuppose God, even if we don't say God. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Because they always try to argue for the godless Constitution when there is none. And then you tie it all the way, like just even during the Civil War, same thing, right? A biblical consciousness is always presupposed, basically. Like you have the pulpits, sermons, pamphlets, yeah. All of it is kept within a biblical consciousness. That's why I say that America is a biblically conscious nation, has a biblical soul. And that is a right understanding of the country as one God, and must understand itself as having one God. And the covenant ethos, like, why I like it, why I love it, is because you remember only one God, and you have only one God, and you're bound to one God. Okay, it's a marriage. There is no other gods for America other than this one God. Okay, the God of Christ, the God of the Bible. Okay. And so the Treaty of Tripoli proves that the federal government has no authority over religion. Religion is left to conscience and states. America rejected the national church, not Christianity. The founder operated in a Christian diplomatic world. This reinforces covenantal federalism. Because there was no national church, religion was preserved at the local, communal, the personal level, just like in covenant theology. And it gives me a final form. It says that the Treaty of Tripoli does not prove America was secular. It proves the federal government was not a Christian confessional authority. That is pure federalism, not secularism. The people, the states, the culture, and the principles of the Republic remain profoundly Christian, as shown in the Declaration, the state constitutions, the Northwest Ordinance, and every other major founding document. And I mentioned common sense realism. It's about epistemology. Like, what about common sense realism? Because it mentions it, right? And it says that how does that reflect in comparison with secularist epistemology, which is the foundational understanding of like God-given rights and natural law and belief in God, right? Like how it all relates, like how each either reinforces the founding and how the other undermines it or destroys it, right? This is that here's a clear, historically grounded, non-ideological way to understand common sense realism versus secularist epistemology in relation to the American founding, natural rights, and the belief in a moral God. What is common sense realism? Common sense realism, a CSR, is a Scottish Enlightenment philosophical tradition. Thomas Reid, Douglas Stewart, James Beattie, that dominated 18th, early and 19th century American education, especially in like Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and William and Mary partially Presbyterian seminaries, many legal curricula. It makes three major claims. Reality is real and accessible. You can Trust your senses, your reason, conscience, and memory. The human faculties are generally reliable because God designed them for truth. It's a read summary. 2. Moral truths are self-evident, contain moral axioms, are directly knowable. Humans have inherent dignity. Basic justice and universal obligations arise from nature. This is why the Declaration uses the word self-evident truths. Jefferson later said this phrase was drawn from the harmonizing sentiments of Reed, Hutcheson, and Locke, and classical natural law. This is 3. Our reasoning capacities are part of God's design. CSR is deistic epistemology without requiring specific Christian doctrine. It maintains a moral universe, design, human faculties, objective natural law, accountability to a creator. This directly supports the founder's concept of rights. What is secular epistemology? By contrast, secular epistemology refers to a post-19th century shift in how many view knowledge. No metaphysical grounding for reason, no objective moral order, no natural purpose to human faculties. Human rights become social constructs, morality becomes subjective or utilitarian. Politics become pure power, not principle. And this is the world of humane skepticism, undermines moral causation. Positivism, Comte, later legal positivists. Higher modern relativism, post-Nietzschean moral subjectivism, later postmodernism. It means that no self-evident truths, no creator to endow rights, no inherent dignity, rights equal government inventions, and this worldview cannot sustain the Declaration's claims. How each view affects natural law and rights, says that common sense realism reinforces the founding because rights come from a creator. CSR gives philosophical justification for the Declaration's opening, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Right, and the reason why I'm doing this is because I only want the ideas that powerfully reinforce our founding. I don't want anything that undermines it. And so that's why I want to know more about these kind of things here. And so 2, human reason reliably knows moral law. If reason is designed by God, natural law is accessible. Duty precedes rights. CSR affirms that rights exist within a moral order, for government is accountable to universal moral truth, meaning tyranny violates the created order, not just social consensus. 5, federalism makes sense because human beings have real God-given spheres of responsibility. Local communities have real moral distinctions. Power is limited because God, not government, is ultimate. In other words, CSR supplies the metaphysical fuel for constitutionalism. Secularist epistemology undermines the founding because you cannot derive rights from atoms or social utility. Rights become government permissions. There is no self-evident morality, therefore the Declaration collapses into rhetoric. The state becomes the ultimate authority since no higher moral order exists. Government defines good and evil. Federalism becomes purely procedural, not moral. Without natural law, federalism becomes arbitrary, a bureaucratic choice, not a covenantal principle. Dignity becomes subjective, not inherent, which historically leads to utilitarian ethics, technocracy, total state centralization, coerced equality by force, weakening of religious liberty. Put simply, secular epistemology dissolves the philosophical foundations of natural rights. So why is this important for your covenant federalism thesis? Because the founders' belief in natural law, human dignity, divinely endowed rights, moral accountability of rulers, a universe governed by moral order, all presuppose common sense realism or similar theistic epistemologies. And federalism is not a secular power-sharing mechanism, a pragmatic compromise, ideological neutrality. Right, also ties into the idea of in the American context, right, in American history, how one also understand belief in God and belief in God and covenant, right, according to obviously the Bible, right, because other people, I think Enlightenment people think that they undermine, I don't know, they just undermine a lot of things like that. And so it's like And in the American mind, it justifies like how one ought to believe in God based on the experiences of the founders and providence, right? Because they genuinely believed in a real experience of God, right, and providential aid or so. And so that justifies like how one ought to believe in God, not as a concept, but as real. And so that is what I also want, like, to understand more of the common sense realism thing. It's only to reinforce the idea, because I see them get undermined by this kind of ideology, this secular ideology. And federalism is a way of organizing society consistent with human nature, rooted in a created moral order, grounded in local stewardship, justified by natural law, not human preference, reinforced by the belief that sovereignty comes from God to the people, then to government. So yes, common sense realism was essential to grounding covenantal federalism. Secular epistemology cannot sustain it. Let me just ask, so in comparison as far as an interpretive framework, right, which is true, basically. Is it American covenantalism or American secularism, right? And so here's the clearest and most historically honest way to answer this without falling into ideology or myth-making. Which interpretive framework is true to the American founding? American covenantalism or American secularism? A short answer is American covenantalism is the correct interpretive framework. American secularism is a later reinterpretation, but to understand why, we have to be precise about what covenantalism and secularism mean in this context. It says, the founding was not Christian theocratic, but it was not secularist either. It sits in a unique middle category, found nowhere else in the West. The founding was morally theistic. Laws of nature, nature's God, creator endowed, rights, providence, and moral order, objective justice. The institutions were religiously non-established. No national church, no theological tests for national office. This combination is exactly what covenantal federalism produces. God creates moral order, persons possesses inherent rights plus duties, communities govern themselves, states retain reserved powers, federal government, limited guardian of justice. This is a covenantal logic, not secular logic. Secularism says rights come from the state, not God. The founders unanimously rejected that premise. 2. Why American federalism fits the founders' worldview. Not because they wanted a church-state system, they didn't, but because they believed that one, human equality is sacred because it is created. Jefferson, 1776, draft notes that the mass of mankind have not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred by the grace of that same creator. Also, I think in the other essay on Jefferson, I don't think I have the correspondence. I have the mentioning of Benneker, right? He's Benjamin Benneker. He's the first African-American scientist. He's like the architect of the White House, right? Even challenges Jefferson on equality from the Bible, right? And Jefferson affirms the equality, right, of men, even the equality of what they have in Christ, right? Which don't think I added on here. I did add in my other essays. I like the idea of covenantal ethics, right? How through the covenant we're able to repent of things like slavery and other injustices, right? Like there's a way to do that, right? Through covenantal logic and stuff. So anyway, it's already gone too long, but I'll just finish this part. Rights are unalienable because they are God-given. Madison, Distidius, precedent both in order and of time, and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society, and meaning duties to God come before the state. The moral law is objective. Atoms, the foundations of national morality, must be laid in religion. Also, I need to double check all these quotes for this section, right? Because I just generated this. Had a prior one, but it was too long or so. Like this one's already going on too long, right? And 4, covenantal idea of distributed authority is assumed. Federalist 39, Madison describes the Constitution as partly federal covenantal, distributed among sovereign peoples, national, one people in certain things, not secular centralization, not theocracy. It is exactly covenantal balance. Providence is assumed throughout. Every major founder from Washington to Franklin to Madison spoke of providence guiding the nation. This is not secular political metaphysics. And 3, why American secularism is not the founding framework. It says secularism denies objective natural law, but the Declaration explicitly grounds the Republic on natural law. Secularism denies God as the source of rights, but the founders explicitly affirm the Creator as the source of rights. Secularism says meaning and morality come from the state. The founders rejected this as tyranny. They believed governments are accountable to a higher moral order. Secularism cannot provide a reason for federalism. Why divide powers if there is no higher authority than the state? Why limit government if rights aren't God-given? Why protect conscience if moral truth is subjective? Federalism makes sense only in a worldview where a human possesses created dignity. Communities have moral stewardship. States have their own covenants and jurisdictions, and government is not the highest authority. This is the heart of covenantal thought. And I already went over the Treaty of Tripoli. And then it just talks about what scholars conclude today, across the board, whether left, right, or center. America was not founded as a secular project. America was not founded as a church-state Christian nation. America was founded on theistic natural law and covenantal federalism. The closest term is Hebraic republicanism, Jewish political philosopher Eric Nelson, or Protestant moral federalism, Mark Knoll, Daniel Dresbach. This means the founders inherited covenantal theology, federal model, covenant theology, federal model, English common laws, moral assumptions, Scottish common sense realism, Lockean natural rights, biblical language of covenant, justice, and liberty, and applied it in a religiously non-established system. And this is not secularism. It's covenantal moral republicanism. And so final answer, the true interpretive framework of the American founding is American covenantalism, not American secularism. Secularism denies every principle the founders used. Covenantalism explains federalism, rights, duties, moral law, liberty, dignity, and limited government. The Treaty of Tripoli does not contradict this. It only rejects a national church. Right, because you can use that as a positive case for a dissenting Lockean Christian nation, right? With like the covenantal presuppositions, and then the founders' philosophy, language, and institutions line up with covenantal federalism, not secular metaphysics, right? So that's all. I'll stop there, right? If you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.